my intention is to very briefly, actually not so briefly anymore, in more than 8 minutes, I guess, to show how we are actually psychologically prepared to be more receptive to bullshit than we might like to think we are, and to also show how I believe philosophy can help in all of this. So I'd like to start with a test. As you may have heard, I'm a teacher, so we all have to take a test. You don't have to write down your answers to this test if you'd like. You can probably just remember them. It's just 4 simple statements. You need to rate these statements that I'm going to show you on how profound you think they are on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all profound and 5 being very profound. And again, you can write them down, scratch them down if you want, or just remember them. So the first statement is, a river cuts through a rock not because of its power, but its persistence. Give it a moment. Stew. Next statement. Nature is a self-regulating ecosystem of awareness. Statement C. Imagination is inside exponential space-time events. Finally, statement D. True identity imparts reality to cosmic creativity. Notice just in the delivery, it also sounds more profound if you kind of emphasize the right words and so on. But all right, so those are your 4 statements to begin with. We'll come back to those later on. We'll talk a little bit more about how they relate to bullshit. Now, I want to start by making the claims concerning psychology. 2 very, very brief psychological dynamics I want to have in our background here as we then explore bullshit a little bit more closely. The first is the cognitive miser model. This was articulated in 1991 by these 2 people that you see here, Susan Fiske and Shelley Taylor. They were inspired by work done by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman about fast and slow systems of thinking that we tend to use. But what the cognitive miser model essentially says is that we are truly Scrooge-like when it comes to our thinking. That we will try to arrive at decisions and judgments using literally the least amount of neural activity possible in order to do so. And this makes evolutionary sense, because why would you burn more energy doing something when you can get by with a shortcut? So we're actually cognitively lazy, unless somehow prompted to not be quite so lazy. Okay, so that's the first. The second is the notion of cognitive habits. Now, this is actually a phrase, the word habit especially, that I've heard other people today mention in terms of philosophy, which actually kind of destroys my point. But, you know, they're on the right track, is this thing. But a cognitive habit is simply a well-worn system of thought, a system of thought that you've practiced over time. And that practice over time is a critical component to creating habit, true habit. And whether it's a behavioral habit or a thinking habit, you have to not just practice it, but you got to have a period of time over which you practice it, years, in fact, in order for it truly to become a habit, hundreds of repetitions potentially. So kind of like the cow path across campus, you can't just get a cow path that well worn the first time across. You got to keep doing this over a period of time. Now imagine you've got 3 different people who experience the same thing. It's a car crash in this case. And they employ their cognitive habits based on, you know, their life's experiences, whatever it is that they've become pretty good at. And the first person is a civil engineer, and his expertise is in traffic flows and controls and so on. And so upon seeing the car crash, wonders, I wonder how the street design could have prevented perhaps this accident. The second person is a daycare provider who's concerned about potentially children who may have been in the car. That's her first thought. And the third person is a paramedic. And you can see how these different habits of mind just kind of kick into gear when presented with certain stimuli in the environment. And this is just the psychological way that we are. Now, I want to next talk about this habit of mind in a slightly different way. When I was back here at Gustavus, do you guys still have a Gribbly? Okay. Is it electronic now, or do you get an actual printed one? Ah, dang it. See, the old paper ones, they were far more fun. This is my really good friend, Hans Lindberg. And when our senior year came around, we were talking about why he was studying physics, why I was studying philosophy. We had this long argument about, you know, which was the truly more foundational study, the truly more important one. Of course, he was wrong. But in the course of the discussion, I asked him, so do you consider yourself a physicist? And he said, actually, yes, I do, because I think like one. And that was always kind of stuck with me. Hans was a bright guy. We'll come back to that again in a moment. Now, on to some bullshit. There's literally a book on bullshit by Harry Frankfurt. He's a Princeton professor, and he wrote this book. It was published in 2005. It got him a few weeks, like 27 weeks, on the New York Times bestseller list, which was pretty impressive. And more impressively, an interview with Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. So you know you've made it, that your bullshit's being taken seriously when Jon Stewart's talking about it. So in the book, I pulled out a few comments, some statements from Frankfurt about what he considers to be bullshit and what it's like. So the bullshitter seeks to convey a certain impression without necessarily being concerned about truth or of the matter and so on. Further, it's actually exactly this lack of not being concerned about the truth or falsity of a matter that he regards as the essence. I mean, the real substance of bullshit is that it might accidentally be true, but that's not really the bullshitter's intention, is to talk truth. And unlike plain lying, it's more especially a matter not of falsity, but of fakery. And I love that word. Fakery is just a great word. I'm going to use that. And then finally, I thought this quote was especially appropriate given what I'm doing right here. Think political pundits on cable television. And you see, this is exactly what's going on anytime they trot out these people. Tell us, about your candidate's position on blah, blah, blah. And they don't really know, but they're going to say something anyway. And you can bet pretty sure it's going to be bullshit. Now, people have taken bullshit quite seriously. There's a psychological study that was published last November, and you can see the title here, on the reception and detection of pseudo-profound bullshit. It was published in the Journal of Judgment and Decision Making, and their core questions of the study were, what is it that is, are people able to detect blatant bullshit, and furthermore, who's most susceptible to it and why? Those are their basic questions. So they applied some really good, hard-fashioned psychology to this question. But in order to do this, they have to present people, of course, with bullshit, which means they need to generate pure bullshit. Turns out there are websites for this. There might be an app, I don't know. But there's the New Age bullshit generator. And this is my favorite one. All that this website does is it takes actual tweets from Deepak Chopra and then rearranges the words. And so I just went on and clicked the generator, and this is it. And you'll recognize the statement from one of the four that I gave you at the beginning here, the true identity statement. So the authors of the study created the bullshit receptivity scale, which, again, it just all sounds, well, never mind. So the idea here is to rate how profound you think it is. These are the 5 ratings and their descriptors on the Likert scale that they presented to people. There's another example of that bullshit statement again. They then took the measures of profundity that they generated from the 10 bullshit statements, and then also measured those same people's what they called reflective analytic thinking skills. And they used several highly validated measures of pretty complex and critical thinking skills, 3 of which I've listed here for us. And what they found is that, yes, you could get people to actually think these pure bullshit statements were, in fact, somewhat profound. Only 18% on average scored the 10 statements somewhere down below 2, and then everybody else was somewhere up above 2. In other words, people are pretty receptive to bullshit and can't really see it. Okay? Now, that's interesting, but what they also found is that as the statistical receptivity to bullshit went up, their reflective analytical thinking went down. So there was this really nicely hypothesized and proven inverse relationship between bullshit and critical thinking. Then they thought, now, just a moment, perhaps these 18% of people who were not necessarily seeing these things as bullshit, maybe they wouldn't find anything to be profound. That they're just not, recognizing what profundity is. So they had to, again, do another study. So what they did is they found 10 what would widely be regarded as somewhat profound statements, such as the river cuts through a rock and so on, and then blended those with the 10 BS statements, then scored the 2 sets of statements separately and then found the difference between them to determine what they called a sensitivity to bullshit. And people who would have a low sensitivity to bullshit, they would rate these 2 sentences and they would kind of come together. The difference would not be as strong. But people with a high sensitivity to bullshit, the statements would go further apart in their rating scales and the averages would be stronger. The difference would be greater, okay? So that's how they measured sensitivity to this. So the results were that as sensitivity increased, as people truly were able to distinguish between bullshit and profound, So did reflective analytic thinking. Beautiful. This is all wonderful stuff. So it really does show that, if you have this kind of thinking skill, that you're not as receptive to bullshit and you are more able to distinguish bullshit from truly profound stuff. So go back to the 4 statements from the beginning. If you go back to your letter A and how you rated that thing, that was the river cuts through a rock, blah, 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 considered profound. So hopefully you rated that one a little bit higher. The second one was an actual tweet from Deepak Chopra. Wherever you put that one, I don't know. And the last 2 statements were generated from the bullshit generators that were used as well. So, kind of see how you're doing. Are your 2 statements much stronger in profundity, hopefully, and your 2 other ones maybe not so much, and then that would indicate high sensitivity, which, of course, we're all philosophy majors. Hopefully that would be true. So the authors were asking then at the end, is there an inoculation against bullshit? And they would argue, yes, it is exactly this reflective analytic thinking, the willingness to stop and think analytically about the actual meanings of words presented and their associations, that is, their logicalness. So, does studying philosophy make one a better bullshit detector? Well, that's why I'm here. Of course it does. Of course it does. So philosophy, you might ask, well, it teaches these things, either 4 general topics of philosophy, that's fine. But what it also teaches are these things. And we've heard all day long from many of the other talkers and speakers about how the thinking skills, the habits of mind that came about as a result of your philosophy degrees were really what apply to all these other kinds of things, and I would argue also make you a better bullshit detector. This is the good reflective analytic thinking that the authors of the paper were talking about. I would further argue that it's a major in philosophy, this practice over time, that really gets that habit of mind ingrained, that creates the cognitive habit and the inoculation against bullshit. And perhaps Hans is right. Perhaps we are, in fact, philosophers because we think like philosophers, which is probably a pretty good thing. So if we were to come across the car crash, there's George. If George were to come across the car crash, perhaps he would ponder the logic. Doug's usually a good driver, but he does tend to imbibe. And he would have a car crash if, and only if, he were drinking. Therefore, Doug's been to Whiskey River once again. Thank you very much.